The air was thick with tension as Officer Darren Reynolds sat in his squad car, watching the busy street corner from behind dark sunglasses. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel impatiently as he scanned the faces of pedestrians. His partner, Officer Blake Carter, was busy checking messages on the laptop. "Another slow day," Carter muttered, stifling a yawn. Reynolds smirked. Not for long. His sharp gaze locked onto a tall black man in a crisp, navy blue suit stepping out of a sleek, black sedan. The man adjusted his tie and checked his watch, his movements calm and deliberate. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Something about him set off alarms in his head. "Look at that guy," Reynolds said, nudging Carter. "Looks out of place, doesn't he?" Carter glanced up and shrugged. "Looks like some businessman." Reynolds wasn't convinced. "Nah, something's off." Without another word, he pushed open the door and stepped out. He adjusted his belt, ensuring his badge was visible, and strode toward the man. The man had barely taken a few steps onto the sidewalk when Reynolds approached. "Hey, hold up," Reynolds barked. The man turned, a calm, unreadable expression on his face. "Yes, officer?" Reynolds gave him a once-over, scanning him for any signs of nervousness. "What are you doing around here?" The man arched an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" Reynolds crossed his arms. "Just asking a question." Carter had joined them now, standing just behind Reynolds. The suited man sighed and reached into his pocket. Instantly, Reynolds' hand went to his holster. "Easy," Carter warned, sensing the situation escalating. The man paused, holding his hands slightly up. "I was just going for my ID," he said slowly. Reynolds didn't relax. "Real slow." The man pulled out a sleek black wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gold badge and ID card. "Special Agent Damian Cole, FBI." There was a long pause. Carter took a step back, instinctively. Reynolds, however, didn't budge. His eyes flickered between the ID and Cole's face. "FBI, huh?" Reynolds muttered, skepticism lacing his tone. Cole gave a tight-lipped smile. "That's what it says, doesn't it?" Reynolds didn't like the way Cole looked at him. There was no fear, no nervousness, just calm control. It irritated him. "Mind telling me what the FBI is doing in this part of town?" Reynolds pressed. Cole's eyes stayed locked on his. "That's classified." Reynolds scoffed. "Classified, huh? You expect me to just take your word for it?" Cole's expression didn't change. "That's usually how jurisdiction works, officer." Reynolds could feel his temper rising. He didn't like being talked down to, especially by someone who thought they were above the law. He glanced at Carter, whose face was a mask of uncertainty. Then Reynolds made his decision. "Turn around," he ordered, pulling out his cuffs. Cole's brow furrowed. "Excuse me." "You heard me. Hands behind your back." Carter shifted uncomfortably. "Reynolds, maybe we should call this in." Reynolds silenced him with a glare. "We've got a possible case of impersonation here." Cole's jaw clenched, but he didn't resist. "This is a mistake." Reynolds smirked. "We'll see about that." He yanked Cole's arms behind him and snapped the cuffs on. People had started to take notice. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Cole remained silent, his face unreadable. They escorted him back to the squad car, pushing him into the back seat. Carter got into the driver's seat, while Reynolds settled in next to Cole. "You just made a big mistake," Cole said evenly. Reynolds scoffed. "Oh yeah? We'll see about that when we run your so-called credentials." Cole leaned back. "You have no idea what you've just done, do you?" Reynolds turned to face him, his smirk fading slightly. "You're the one in cuffs, Agent." Cole just stared at him. And for the first time, Reynolds felt something unsettling. It wasn't fear. It was something worse, uncertainty. They drove in silence to the precinct. The moment they stepped inside, things took a turn. The desk sergeant, a grizzled man named Holloway, barely glanced up until he saw Cole. His eyes widened. "What the hell is going on here?" Holloway demanded. Reynolds pulled out Cole's ID. "Picked him up for impersonating an officer. Claims he's FBI." Holloway's face paled. "You idiot," Holloway snapped. Reynolds frowned. "Excuse me." Before Holloway could answer, a door down the hallway burst open. A tall, commanding black man in an FBI windbreaker stormed in, followed by 2 more agents. His eyes locked onto Cole, then onto Reynolds. "Who arrested Agent Cole?" the man demanded. Reynolds swallowed. "I did." The agent's jaw tightened. "Uncuff him. Now." Reynolds hesitated, but Holloway barked. "Now, Reynolds." He fumbled for his keys, unlocking the cuffs. Cole rubbed his wrists, then stepped forward. The room was silent. "Agent Cole," the senior agent said, his voice dangerously calm. "Are you all right?" Cole nodded. "Nothing I can't handle, sir." The senior agent turned to Reynolds. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You just arrested a federal agent in the middle of an undercover operation." Silence. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. "You compromised months of work," the agent continued. "Do you even understand the consequences of your actions?" Reynolds clenched his fists. "I was just doing my job." The senior agent's eyes were cold. "No, Officer Reynolds. You let your bias do your job for you." The weight of the accusation hit harder than Reynolds expected. Around them, officers exchanged uneasy glances. The senior agent turned to Holloway. "We'll be filing a formal complaint. This isn't over." Holloway nodded solemnly. "Understood." The agents turned, with Cole being the last to leave. As he passed Reynolds, he paused. Their eyes met. Cole leaned in slightly. "Next time, do your homework before you put cuffs on the wrong person." Then he was gone. Reynolds stood there, feeling the heat of a dozen stares burning into him. His heart pounded. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure where he stood. Reynolds stood in the middle of the precinct, feeling the weight of his own mistake pressing down on him like a lead blanket. The murmurs around him were low, but he could hear them. Whispers from other officers. Some scoffing, some shaking their heads, others exchanging knowing glances. Carter was still beside him, his expression unreadable. But Reynolds could feel the shift. He wasn't the cop people looked up to anymore. He wasn't the hard-nosed officer who always got his man. He was now the guy who had just arrested an FBI agent in the middle of an active operation. The guy who had compromised a case. And worst of all, the guy who had done it for all the wrong reasons. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, to justify his actions. But there was nothing to say. Cole hadn't been acting suspiciously. He hadn't been breaking the law. He hadn't done anything except exist in a space Reynolds thought he didn't belong in. And that thought made his stomach churn with something he didn't want to name. Holloway sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "Reynolds, my office." "Now." Reynolds swallowed the lump in his throat and followed his superior, feeling Carter's eyes on him as he walked. The office door shut behind them, and Holloway gestured to the chair across his desk. Reynolds sat stiffly. Holloway didn't sit. He just stood there, glaring at him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "You have any idea how bad you just screwed up?" Reynolds's jaw tightened. No, shut up," Holloway snapped, pointing a finger at him. "Because whatever excuse you're about to give me, I don't want to hear it." He paced behind his desk. "Do you know how hard I had to work to get the Bureau to not come down here and pull you out in cuffs? Do you?" Reynolds frowned. "Come on, Sarge. Cuffs." Holloway stopped pacing and gave him a hard look. "Yes, cuffs. You falsely arrested a federal agent, obstructed an ongoing investigation, and if that wasn't enough, you did it in broad daylight, in front of civilians with their phones out. That video's probably making the rounds online as we speak. I don't even want to imagine the headlines." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't thought about that. He had been so certain, so sure, that he was doing the right thing. But looking back, his gut twisted at the realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been looking for something that wasn't there. Holloway sighed and sat down, rubbing his temples. "You're lucky. Cole didn't press charges, and his boss was more interested in salvaging his operation than taking you down. But this isn't going away." Reynolds clenched his fists. "What does that mean?" "It means Internal Affairs is going to have a long talk with you," Holloway said. "And you're off the streets until further notice." Reynolds shot up from his chair. "What? That's bull." "Sit." Down. Reynolds hesitated, but obeyed, biting his tongue. Holloway shook his head. You don't get it, do you? I can't protect you from this. And quite frankly, I don't know if I should. His voice softened slightly. Reynolds, you've been a good cop. But today, you didn't act like one. Reynolds swallowed hard. Those words hit deeper than he expected. He felt something stir inside him. Shame, regret, anger. He didn't know which one was stronger. I need your badge and your gun, Holloway finally said. Reynolds hesitated, his heart pounding. He looked at Holloway, hoping for some sign that this was just a bad dream, that it wasn't as serious as it felt. But all he saw was disappointment. Slowly, he reached for his belt, unhooking his gun, and placing it on the desk. Then, with slightly trembling fingers, he unpinned his badge and laid it beside the weapon. Holloway picked them up and sighed. Go home, Darren. Wait for the call. Reynolds nodded stiffly and stood, his body feeling heavier than it had in years. He walked out of the office, and the moment he stepped into the bullpen, the whispers stopped. All eyes were on him. He ignored them, pushing through the precinct doors and into the cool evening air. He drove home in silence, his mind racing. Every memory of the day replayed over and over, but now, with the clarity of hindsight, it didn't look like the righteous bust he had convinced himself it was. It looked exactly like what it was, a mistake. And the worst part? Cole had known it the whole time. Reynolds sat in his dimly lit apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand, untouched. His mind was restless, unable to settle. He had been in law enforcement for over a decade. He had seen it all: drug busts, homicides, domestic disputes. He had always prided himself on being one of the good guys, the kind of cop who stood for justice, who didn't let criminals walk free. So why did today feel like he was the one who had done something wrong? His phone buzzed on the table. He reached for it, expecting Carter or maybe Holloway. But the number was unfamiliar. He hesitated before answering. Reynolds. Officer Reynolds, came a familiar voice. Calm, steady. Reynolds's grip tightened on the phone. Agent Cole. There was a pause. Then, meet me. Reynolds frowned. Why? Cole's voice didn't change. Because we need to talk. Reynolds glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. This didn't make sense. About what? You'll find out when you get here. Before Reynolds could ask anything else, the line went dead. He stared at the phone for a long moment before cursing under his breath. He grabbed his keys and left. The meeting place was an empty parking lot downtown. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets nearly deserted. Reynolds pulled in, spotting Cole leaning against his sleek black sedan. The same car from earlier that day. The irony wasn't lost on him. He got out, approaching slowly. This some kind of setup? Cole didn't smile. If it was, you'd already be in cuffs. Reynolds exhaled sharply. Then what is this? Cole studied him for a moment. I wanted to see if you'd actually show up. Reynolds scoffed. And? Cole nodded slightly. You did. That's something. Reynolds crossed his arms. You said we needed to talk. So talk. Cole sighed, glancing around before speaking. The case I was working on, the one you nearly blew, it's still ongoing. And now, thanks to today, I need to move fast. Reynolds frowned. What does that have to do with me? Cole's eyes locked onto his. I need your help. Reynolds blinked. My help? He laughed, shaking his head. You have to be joking. I'm not. Reynolds rubbed his face. You do realize I'm suspended, right? No badge, no gun, no authority. Cole's lips pressed into a thin line. That doesn't mean you can't be useful. Reynolds's mind raced. This was insane. Just hours ago, he had arrested this man, humiliated himself in front of his entire department. And now he was standing here, being asked to assist on a federal case? He looked at Cole. The agent's face was unreadable, but his eyes held something Reynolds hadn't noticed before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't smugness. It was something closer to understanding. Reynolds exhaled. Why me? Cole didn't hesitate. Because you need to prove to yourself that you're better than today. The words hit harder than they should have. Reynolds wanted to deny it, to walk away, and pretend he didn't care. But the truth was, he did. He took a long breath before finally saying, "What do you need me to do?" Cole gave a small nod, then opened his car door. "Get in. I'll explain on the way." Reynolds hesitated for only a second before stepping into the unknown. Reynolds sat in the passenger seat of Cole's car, his hands resting on his knees as the agent pulled onto the road. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them, thick with tension and unspoken thoughts. The weight of the day still hung over him like a storm cloud, but now there was something else, a sliver of curiosity, a need to understand why a man he had humiliated, arrested, and nearly ruined was now giving him a second chance. Cole drove with the kind of calm that made Reynolds uneasy, as if he already knew the outcome of whatever was about to happen. The streets passed in a blur, the neon lights of late-night businesses flickering like ghosts in the dark. They left the main roads behind, moving toward the industrial district, an area Reynolds knew well, a place of warehouses, forgotten streets, and people who operated in the shadows. Finally, Cole pulled into an empty lot behind an abandoned factory. The car idled in silence, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Cole didn't move right away. He just sat there, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. Reynolds cleared his throat. "You gonna tell me what the hell this is about?" Cole turned to him, his expression unreadable. "The man you arrested me for? The one you were so sure was a criminal?" Reynolds felt his stomach twist. He didn't answer. Cole smirked slightly, but it wasn't amusement. It was something colder. "His name is Andrei Novak. Eastern European Syndicate. Runs drugs, guns, and people through this city like it's his personal playground. And for the past 2 years, I've been working to take him down." He tapped the steering wheel. "That is, until you stepped in and gave him a reason to suspect we're onto him." Reynolds clenched his jaw. He didn't need Cole to spell it out. His mistake hadn't just embarrassed him. It had compromised a federal investigation. Cole continued, his voice steady. "After your little stunt, Novak vanished. He dumped his phone, changed locations, and cut off contact with all his known associates. We had eyes on him for weeks, but now, nothing. He's a ghost." Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "So what do you need me for? You think I can magically find him?" Cole studied him for a long moment. "No, but I think you can get close to someone who can." Reynolds frowned. "Who?" Cole reached into the back seat and pulled out a thin file. He tossed it onto Reynolds' lap. Reynolds opened it, scanning the contents. A name stood out immediately, Victor Rains. Reynolds stiffened. He knew Rains, a former informant, a mid-level player in the city's underworld. The kind of guy who had his fingers in everything but never let his hands get too dirty. Smart enough to stay off law enforcement's radar. Slippery enough to avoid being caught when things went sideways. Reynolds glanced up. "Rains." Cole nodded. "He's one of Novak's key distributors. He moves product, cleans money, and keeps his ear to the ground. If anyone knows where Novak is, it's him." Reynolds scoffed. "And you think he's just going to tell me?" Cole's smirk returned, but this time there was an edge to it. "He might, if you play it right." Reynolds shook his head, tossing the file back onto the dashboard. "No way. Rains knows me. He knows I'm a cop." Cole didn't blink. Not anymore. The words sent a chill down Reynolds' spine. He stared at Cole, his mind racing. Cole leaned back against his seat. "Rains won't trust the FBI. Won't trust anyone who looks too official. But you're different now. You're the disgraced cop. The guy who just got suspended. The guy with nothing left to lose." He paused. That's someone he might be willing to talk to. Reynolds swallowed hard. He didn't like this. Not one bit. He had spent years on the right side of the law, even when the lines blurred. But now, Cole was asking him to step over that line, to use his own downfall as a weapon. Reynolds exhaled slowly. "And if I say no?" Cole tilted his head. "Then you go home, sit on your couch, and spend the next few weeks waiting for internal affairs to decide your fate." He turned to face Reynolds fully. "But if you say yes, you help me fix this. You help me make sure Novak doesn't slip away because of a mistake you made." Reynolds clenched his jaw. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to pretend this wasn't his problem. But the truth was, it was. He had screwed up, and now people, innocent people, could pay the price for it. He took a long breath. Where do I start? Cole's smirk faded, replaced by something more serious. You start by making Raines believe you're exactly what he thinks you are. The bar smelled like stale beer and bad decisions. It was the kind of place where men with too many regrets went to drown them in cheap whiskey, where deals were made in hushed voices, and where the right, or wrong, word could get you killed. Reynolds stepped inside, his gut already telling him this was a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. Raines was at the back, sitting in a booth, a glass of something dark in front of him. He looked up as Reynolds approached, his expression shifting from confusion to amusement. Well, Raines drawled, leaning back. If it isn't Officer Reynolds. He gestured to the seat across from him. Or should I say, former officer? Reynolds sat, keeping his expression neutral. I need a drink. Raines chuckled, waving down the bartender. A moment later, a glass was placed in front of Reynolds. He didn't touch it. Raines studied him. So, to what do I owe the pleasure? You finally realizing which side pays better. Reynolds exhaled, leaning forward. I'm done playing the good guy, Raines. You of all people should understand what happens when you put your trust in the wrong people. He forced a bitter smile. The department turned its back on me. I gave them everything, and they threw me to the wolves. Raines swirled his drink, watching him carefully. And now, Reynolds shrugged. Now, I'm just looking out for myself. A slow smile spread across Raines's face. That's so. Reynolds met his gaze. I hear you're looking for reliable people. Raines didn't respond right away. He just studied him, as if trying to see through the act. Finally, he nodded. Maybe. But trust? That's earned. Reynolds leaned back, forcing himself to appear unconcerned. Then tell me how to earn it. Raines smirked, tapping his fingers on the table. I might have a job for you. Something small. A test, if you will. Reynolds kept his breathing steady. I'm listening. Raines's smirk widened. Good. He reached into his pocket and slid a small folded piece of paper across the table. Reynolds picked it up, unfolding it slowly. There was an address, a time, and 2 words that made his blood run cold. No cops. Reynolds clenched his jaw, slipping the paper into his pocket. He had just stepped onto a path he might not be able to walk back from. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to. Reynolds sat in his car outside the bar for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of what he had just agreed to pressed down on him like a boulder, his chest tightening with every passing second. He had spent years hunting criminals like Raines, building cases against men who thought they were untouchable. Now, in the span of one disastrous night, he was about to step into their world. He pulled the paper from his pocket again, staring at the address scribbled across it. Industrial District. Midnight. No cops. No way this was something small. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10:47 p.m. If he was going to do this, he needed to move. But first, he needed to check in with Cole. The FBI agent picked up on the second ring. Talk to me, Cole said. Reynolds hesitated before answering. I have a meeting. Midnight. Raines is testing me. A pause. Then Cole's voice came through, calm but firm. Where? Industrial District. Didn't say what for. Just gave me an address and told me to show up alone. Cole exhaled sharply. That's not good. Raines doesn't do small jobs. If he's pulling you in, it's because he wants to see how far you're willing to go. Reynolds ran a hand down his face. So what do I do? You go, Cole said. We'll be watching. Reynolds frowned. I thought the whole point was to make sure Raines believed I wasn't working with the cops. If he so much as suspects you're following me. We won't be anywhere near you, Cole cut in. But we'll have eyes on the area. If things go south, we'll step in. Reynolds didn't like it. He didn't like any of this. But what choice did he have? Fine, he said, then hung up. The next hour crawled by. He drove aimlessly, circling the city, trying to calm the storm raging inside him. He thought about his badge, the career he had thrown away in a moment of blind arrogance. He thought about the people who had looked up to him, about the men he had trained who would now see his name dragged through the mud. And then he thought about Novak, the real criminal, the man who was still out there, slipping further from the FBI's grasp because of him. By the time the clock neared midnight, Reynolds had made up his mind. He pulled up to the address Raines had given him. It was an abandoned warehouse, the kind of place that had been forgotten by the city, left to decay in silence. A single streetlight flickered at the edge of a lot, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Reynolds stepped out of his car, his senses on high alert. The night was quiet, too quiet. He had been in situations like this before, and they rarely ended well. A door creaked open in the distance. Then footsteps. Raines emerged from the darkness, a cigarette dangling from his lips, a smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. Behind him, two men followed, their faces half hidden in the dim light. "Right on time," Raines said. "I like that." Reynolds didn't respond. He just waited. Raines gestured toward the warehouse. "Let's take a walk." Reynolds followed, his heartbeat steady but fast. The two men behind him kept close, their presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. Inside, the warehouse was almost completely empty except for a single metal table and a few crates stacked against the far wall. A single hanging bulb buzzed overhead, casting eerie shadows across the concrete floor. Raines turned to face him, his smirk never fading. "You say you're done being a cop. You say you're looking for something real." He pulled a small duffel bag from one of the crates and tossed it onto the table. "Let's see if that's true." Reynolds unzipped the bag and felt his stomach drop. Stacks of cash, a gun, and something wrapped in plastic that he didn't need to inspect to recognize. Drugs. A lot of them. Raines watched him closely. "This is a simple job. Take the bag, drive it across town, drop it off at the location I give you, and come back. Do that, and maybe we'll talk about something bigger." Reynolds kept his expression neutral. "And if I say no?" Raines's smile widened. "Then we know exactly what kind of man you are. And we don't like cops, former or not." One of the men behind him shifted slightly. Reynolds didn't need to turn around to know he was armed. He looked back at the bag. The weight of his choices pressed down on him. If he refused, he was dead. If he took it and got caught, his career was over for good. And if he played this right, he might just get one step closer to Novak. Reynolds zipped the bag shut, grabbed it off the table, and turned toward the door. "Where's the drop?" Raines grinned, pulling a slip of paper from his pocket and handing it to him. "Midtown. Don't be late." Reynolds walked out without another word. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained stone cold. He had crossed the line. Now, there was no turning back. He drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. Every part of him screamed that this was wrong, that he was in over his head. But he knew the truth. This was the only way forward. Cole's voice rang in his head. "We'll be watching." Were they? Had they seen what just happened? If the FBI intercepted him now, it was all over. He pulled up to the address Raines had given him, a nondescript parking lot behind a rundown motel. A lone figure stood by a black SUV, waiting. Reynolds took a deep breath, grabbed the duffel, and stepped out of the car. The man eyed him warily. "You got the stuff?" Reynolds tossed the bag onto the hood of the SUV. "It's all there." The man unzipped the bag, checked inside, then nodded. "You're clear. Tell Raines he made a good choice." Reynolds didn't respond. He just turned and walked back to his car. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. He had done it. He had just made a drop for a criminal organization. And no one had stopped him. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Nice work. Keep going. Cole." Reynolds exhaled sharply. He wasn't just in this now, he was all the way in. And he had no idea how far down this rabbit hole went. Reynolds sat in his car, gripping the wheel as his mind raced. He had just completed his first job for Raines, and the reality of what he had done was sinking in. He had crossed the line, delivered drugs, taken orders from a criminal, and played his part convincingly. But the real question was, how much deeper would he have to go before he got to Novak? And more importantly, how much of himself would be left by the time he did? His phone buzzed again, another message from Cole. Stay the course. We've got you covered. Covered. Right. That was easy for Cole to say when he wasn't the one sitting in a dark parking lot, wondering if he'd just sold his soul. Reynolds exhaled, forcing himself to focus. He needed to keep his head in the game. The moment he hesitated, the moment he second-guessed anything, was the moment he'd end up in a shallow grave. Raines was watching him, testing him, waiting for a sign that he wasn't who he claimed to be. And men like Raines didn't give second chances. He started the car and pulled out of a lot, driving aimlessly through the city. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, the neon lights of the liquor stores and late-night diners flickering in the darkness. Every red light gave him a moment to reflect on his badge, his past, his future. It felt like he was watching his own life unravel from a distance, like an observer in someone else's nightmare. When he finally pulled up to his apartment complex, exhaustion weighed on him, but sleep was out of the question. He climbed the stairs, entered his apartment, and locked the door behind him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to sink into his couch, his head in his hands. He could still feel the weight of the duffel bag in his grip, the cold sweat on his skin from standing in that parking lot, waiting to see if he'd be gunned down or given a nod of approval. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Come to the Red Lantern. 2 a.m. Alone. Reynolds swore under his breath. No time to rest. This was how it was going to be. Raines pulling the strings, yanking him deeper into the abyss. He pushed himself up, splashed cold water on his face, and grabbed his jacket. The Red Lantern was a seedy nightclub on the outskirts of town, a place where deals were made in the shadows and laws didn't exist. When Reynolds walked in, the heavy bass of the music pounded against his chest, the air thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. Scantily clad waitresses moved between tables where men whispered in hushed voices, exchanging money and secrets. Raines was waiting for him in a private booth near the back. He was relaxed, a drink in his hand, that same infuriating smirk on his face. But Reynolds noticed the other two men flanking him, different from the ones before, but just as dangerous. Reynolds slid into the booth. Didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Raines chuckled. You did good tonight. But one job doesn't mean I trust you. He leaned forward, his smirk fading. You want to be a part of this? You need to prove yourself. Again. Reynolds knew this was coming. The first job was always a test run. The real test was what came next. He kept his expression neutral. What do you need? Raines gestured to one of the men beside him, who pulled a small, black case from under the table and slid it over to Reynolds. Inside that case is something very valuable to me, Raines said. It's being held at a storage unit across town. I need you to go there, pick it up, and bring it back. Reynolds didn't move. His instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't a simple errand. It never was. What's inside? Raines tilted his head, watching him. That's not your concern. Your concern is making sure it gets here in one piece. No cops. No delays. Reynolds nodded slowly. He didn't have a choice. Where's the address? Raines slid a slip of paper across the table. Better get moving. And Reynolds, his voice dropped, his eyes sharp, if you screw this up, don't bother coming back. Reynolds pocketed the paper, stood, and left without another word. As soon as he stepped outside, he took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to steady himself. The deeper he went, the more dangerous this got. But backing out wasn't an option. Not yet. He got into his car and unfolded the paper. The address was across town, in an area he knew well, abandoned warehouses, low security, the kind of place where things went missing without a trace. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first job had been straightforward, deliver a package, no questions asked. But this was different. When he arrived, the storage facility was dark and quiet. He parked a block away, scanning the area before getting out. No cars, no movement. He approached the unit, key in hand, and unlocked the door. The second he stepped inside, he knew he had walked into a trap. The door slammed shut behind him. A flashlight clicked on, blinding him. And then he heard the voice, the one he hadn't heard in years. Well, well, look who finally crawled out of the gutter. Reynolds' blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Novak, the man he had spent years hunting. The man who had ruined lives, bribed officials, and gotten away with everything. And now he was standing in front of Reynolds, grinning like he had just won a long game of chess. I have to admit, Novak said, circling him, I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to walk right into my hands. But here you are. Reynolds' mind raced. This wasn't just Rains testing him. This was something bigger. Rains and Novak were working together. And that meant Reynolds was in more trouble than he had ever imagined. Didn't think you were back in town, Reynolds said, keeping his voice steady. Novak smirked. Oh, I never left. I just stopped letting you see me. He stepped closer. Tell me, Reynolds, how does it feel, knowing you're one of us now? Reynolds didn't answer. He was too busy calculating his next move. Because if Novak was here, then this wasn't just about proving himself to Rains anymore. This was about survival. And if he wanted to make it out alive, he had to think fast.